Well, good evening. On behalf of Banco Sabadell, I would like to welcome Professor Roger Myerson and express my sincere thanks to him for agreeing to take part in the 33rd edition of the Barcelona Graduate School of Economic lecture series. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to both students and members of the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics, as well as the other participants in what promises to be a thought-provoking lecture for all of us. Professor Roger Myerson is the Glenn A. Lloyd Distinguished Service Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago. As I am sure you are all well aware, Professor Myerson was awarded the 2007 Nobel Prize in Economics. For my introduction, I've chosen the most obvious of the many outstanding achievements of Professor Myerson's impressive career. But in a few moments, Professor Barbera will say a little bit more about him. Professor Myerson has been a leading contributor to the fields of game theory, auction theory, and mechanism design. From his broad and varied range of research topics, Professor Myerson has chosen to discuss this evening the local agency costs of political centralization. We are in the midst of large structural changes in the political landscape worldwide, so it's certainly a privilege to listen to what Professor Myerson wishes to share with us about those topics. I'm sure we will enjoy this special evening. Now over to Professor Barbera. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to say a few words before the lecture that we are about to hear from Roger Myerson. And I thank the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics officers and the Bank of Sabadell for giving me this opportunity. At my own risk, I have decided to skip any formal presentation of our speaker's biography and accomplishments. You know there are many and of the highest level. I prefer to say a few words about some characteristics of the person, which I find remarkable. And please, Roger, excuse me if I happen to misrepresent you along the way. Okay. I would like to emphasize that Roger Myerson is a man of principles, extremely concerned about the future of humanity, and that he is a real scientist who believes in science's ability to help us solve the problems that different societies are confronted with. His genuine concern for social problems have led him to transcend the limits of economics and plunge into the social sciences at large, and especially into political science. And then his confidence in science as the way to search for the truth has led him to use the best available knowledge to treat social issues and to develop his own models and tools whenever he has found the need to fill some intellectual gap. Of course, not anyone who tries is able to develop novel methods to tackle with old and new issues in new ways. This is a privilege of a few minds like Roger's. But that would not happen without the preconditions I am trying to emphasize: an urge to work for a better world, and the absolute confidence in the power of science as the tool toward true solutions for human and social problems. You may or may not agree with today's presentation by Professor Myerson on local agency costs of political centralization. But I am sure that you will share with me the feeling of being in front of a most powerful mind, striving to make the best use of his talent in order to help all of us to live in a better society. So, thank you.
Thank you for the perfect introduction. That's it's an introduction. You said nice things. Let me say one thing. I'm going to flatter myself for a moment. I want you to know that when I interviewed for my first job, at Northwestern University, where I had the privilege of working for 25 years in a great research environment. I forget whether it's Mort Kamian or Dave Barron who told me that I looked, when I was first interviewing, they said, you know, you look just like one of our graduate students. And that, I flatter myself that they were thinking of Salvador had just graduated from the same department. And I like to think that's what they were thinking of. But more importantly, enough personal, let me get serious about the substance at hand, which Salvador, you have done. I want to give a talk on local agency costs of political centralization. It's something that it's a new paper. I'll try to give I'll skip some of the technical details, but it's not a very technical paper. I have some other technical papers that I'm very proud of that I would have liked, but this is about this. And in fact, let me say I want to show you some models. I'm a theorist, and I'm going to talk about some models. I think by a theorist looking for new models of politics I could put that in other words, we're engaging with the question of what are the useful ways of thinking about, in this case, government, the models of problems in government. Whatever it is we're modeling, when we economic and political theorists look at it, we're thinking, what are the useful ways of thinking about these problems in society? The models I'm about to show you, I think, are not technically very impressive. They're pretty easy models. On the other hand, there are lots of pretty easy models. So the fact that I'm going to stand up and say, this, for a Barcelona GSE lecture, is a really, is one of the most important things I could talk about, for the better part of an hour that I'm allowed, is a substantive statement about how should we be thinking about politics. And I think the technical experts will say these are not very deep mathematical models, but they are a little different from the other models people have been doing of government. There's no median voter theorem in here, for example. And I think whatever we do, whether we work in theoretical modeling or with mathematical techniques or just seat of the pants arguing about our political reform, we are abstracting from a complex world. And what are the right abstractions that simplify away, that shed light? So I see a big problem that I think these models shed, that I'm trying to put into the center of our discussion in a way that I can make, at least within the mathematical framework, some statements. I had a couple of other things I thought about, but I want you to know that my opening slide here lists our host for the Barcelona GSC lecture, Sabadell, for the auditorium. Well, thank you. We should cite also, but I also want to emphasize that the existence of United Cities and Local Governments global headquarters here in Barcelona, and I'm privileged to have the global president Josep Roig here in the auditorium, as an organization that exists to monitor and encourage the spread of democratic local government in the world is, I think, an extremely important fact that I want scholars, their organization provides information both to mayors and to scholars, and they I think, should be interacting with great scholars at the Barcelona GSE community. And I want to make that introduction, and that's why I've included their address on my cover slide. So now you all know how to find them and ask them about their. But first, go to their webpage and take a look at their gold reports. And if you do research in this area as a student or faculty member and you find their data useful, I hope you'll on the problems and accomplishments of municipal governments in the world, then. That's a resource I want to advertise to people who are doing good work in the city where their global headquarters is. So, let's get going. The first important thing is to say, I think there is fundamental reasons to think that democratic local government, responsible local government, may be undersupplied in many parts of the world. Not in my country, the United States, for historical reasons, and I think you've just had by the way, the fact that there have been very interesting municipal elections here is a complete coincidence, and obviously I'm not prepared to say anything profound about that. That's just anyway. but I think for example, in Africa, there are many countries where democracy has been introduced with some solidness, but it has been excessively, I want to say centralized, I want to say excessively centralized relative to what's good for the country, relative to what should be good for most of the people of the country. How can I why should we even expect such a thing? The answer is because whoever gets to be, whether by election or whatever the system is, whoever gets national power, in some sense, has a vested interest in the centralization of power under any political system. And so in some sense, we may expect there to be a bias for, quote, excessive, by whatever the standards are, centralization of power. That is, national leaders have an intrinsic interest not in centralizing power, sometimes for the good of the country, but also some for reasons that are not necessarily for the good of the country. So that means, I think, to counter that, we economists and political scientists need to be particularly aware of what are the potential benefits of political decentralization. I've written about 3 in particular, and I want to at least mention the other 2 that are not this talk, because, and in particular, the first bullet point in the slide, I'll read it. Autonomous local governments, I want to argue, reduce entry barriers into national politics. And you should understand, as successful local leaders who can become strong, competitive candidates for higher office. What I want to argue in terms of, in the familiar framework of industrial organization, is that responsible subnational government that's responsible, where leaders are elected to, local leaders are elected by autonomous local elections, but then have an opportunity to exercise power and budgetary authority, create opportunities for proving that maybe you can provide better government, you can provide public service better than the corrupt leaders at the national level. And when voters become disenchanted with national democracy because they see competition between 2 or 3 major national parties being dominated by corruption, and they start looking for somebody who can, well, anybody can make a speech saying, elect me president of your country and I will fight corruption. Unfortunately, the people who are in power already made such speeches. So how do you know who you can trust? Well, the answer is people who have actually exercised budgetary authority. I can make a fancy speech, but I've never had exercised a budgetary authority with billions of euros of public money to spend. But mayors and chief ministers or governors of provinces have, and where they do a better job, that provides some proof that maybe they should be taken seriously as candidates for higher office. And in fact, so I want to argue that we have those countries, such as mine and I think yours, that have subnational government that's locally elected and exercises real responsibility. We have better national government than we would have had otherwise. In America, our local governments are typically have many more corruption scandals than our national government historically. But I want to argue that we probably have better national government in America because we've had the opportunity when American voters became disillusioned with the dominant national parties to elect. American voters have typically elected good governors to become president. That dynamic is lowering barriers to entry in national politics. The second point I've tried to make in the context of a counterinsurgency doctrine is that decentralized government guarantees that in every part of the country there are popularly supported local leaders who have a stake in the political system. I'll give you one application of that. I think in Ukraine, the extreme centralization of the country made it extremely easy for an insurgency to separate Donetsk and Luhansk province last year. Today's talk will be on the fundamental questions that simply efficient local public investment requires local accountability, because local public services and local investments to improve the quality of a community, make a community a better place to live and do business. It's the people who live in the community who have the best information about how well local officials are spending the public funds, and local accountability of those officials to local public opinion is essential to giving them the incentive to spend that money correctly. So I'm going to consider to emphasize that point, which I think is absolutely fundamental in the problems of development in many parts of the world. I'll say a few things about data, but very little. I'm a theorist, and I'm going to try to give you a theoretical model to try to put that phenomenon, which I believe to be hugely important in understanding poverty in many parts of the world. I'm going to consider a model of moral hazard, put it in local public services, which has an efficient solution that's feasible when officials are accountable to local voters, but becomes infeasible when we try to embed local government in a centralized state where the officials are directly accountable not to local voters, but to a national president or prime minister who appointed them. So many people have argued that political decentralization and community empowerment may be essential for successful development. I certainly want to emphasize the UCLG Gold Report as a very useful summary of information about this, where local democracy has gone. But I want to mention in particular Louise Fortman's 1983 report to the government of Botswana. She's actually a sociologist, and she looks at the problems of community development. She says these communities have within the community the ability to mobilize their own meager resources to provide local public services, but the national government is insisting on its appointed officials having control, and they're not doing it. They're not accountable in the right way, and her report was taken seriously by the government of Botswana, and I've seen suggestions that it may have had something to do with the great success of Botswanan development in contrast with almost every other country in that period elsewhere in Africa. The Martinez Bravo Padre Miguel Chian Yao study, if you have two Spanish and two Chinese co-authors, then the Spanish names just crowd out the Chinese. This is, I think, a very important study. They find that when the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party made a decision to allow local villages to elect their own local governments in different parts of China, different years, but around 1987, the result was a vast increase of local public spending on roads and irrigation and public schooling, building public schools, and this was largely financed not by increased funds from the central government, but by collections within the village itself, that the villagers were able to cooperate. Anyway, so these are first-order development questions. They have not been sufficiently studied, and I'm not an empiricist, and the Ponce Rodriguez et al. Paper is one that has been based on a global database of cross-country comparison. But anyway, Dan Treisman has a very good book in 2007. I think it's called The Architecture of Government, that takes on many of us who are starry-eyed about the virtues of federalism, and he argues that many arguments for federalism, for political decentralization, are weak. He says a unitary state could just as well apply different policies across regions, and both for regional differences or for experimentation. But I want to argue that when the quality, so the core of this talk is that when the quality of local public services can be observed only by local residents, then the responsible officials cannot be held accountable for this quality, for spending money correctly to provide high-quality public services, unless the local residents have some effective power over these officials' career. This is a straightforward argument within information economics. When there's an opportunity to steal the money, and the only people who know that you're not providing public services are local residents, then the local residents have information, had better be able to, use their information to punish you for your malfeasance, and otherwise you have no incentive not to steal the money when you are the local official. So the local residents must have some effective power over these officials' careers. I think political decentralization means that there's some kind of constitutional guarantee of local residents' power to dismiss their local government officials. Now, without such guarantees, it's still possible. So when I get to the centralized model, I want to say the national leader could ask local residents, is he doing a good job? And the national political leader could say, you know, I'm going to try to apply a policy that says if the local residents aren't happy, I'm going to fire the people who I appointed and get somebody else. But will he do it? Now there's moral hazard at the center. Does the national leader actually want to act on this information? Obviously, if it's not guaranteed, then there may be some slip. And failure to ensure good services can deter people from making private investments in a community that build up the prosperity of the community, because the profitability of our private investments in business and manufacturing and commercial commerce or whatever it is we're providing, if local private investments are dependent as they are on property rights protection, transportation networks, and other infrastructure investments that have to be public, then the failure to guarantee that these will be provided in the future, may deter people from making private investments in their community. And I stand before you as someone who passionately believes that some of the poorest countries of the world are poor because they've been unable to mobilize resources for public investments, and I want to say that perhaps the moral hazard problems I'm talking about may have something to do with it. But so let's get to the model. So it should be a simple model. It's as complicated. The basic framework is as complicated as this slide. So I'm going to say there's some letters to be introduced. There's a remote town. By remote, I mean it's far from the capital in a country. And I guess I'm thinking of Africa has had a number of countries that I say have had very centralized governments that have not decentralized power to locally elected officials. Traditional chiefs are appointed by national ministries. They depend on the national government for their certification in many countries. Anyway, consider a remote town with N residents. Each resident has to first make an investment that I'll call it capital K to start an enterprise. And that enterprise is potentially very profitable, but its profitability will depend on public services. So every year, the enterprise can either return some big amount, capital S, to the resident who, if he makes his business in this town, that's a positive number, or which comes S stands for success, or zero. So every year you get either S or zero, and I'm going to assume everyone's risk neutral. I know zero in a year sounds like starvation, and that's no joke in poor countries. But in this abstraction, I'll assume risk neutrality and linear utility. Probability of success depends on the public services. So in any year, I said N was the number of residents, so little g stands for the public spending on local public services. And I guess I'm thinking protection of property rights, law enforcement, basic law and order within the community that a business needs to be successful is one good thing to think about. Or local roads that are only used by local residents for their commerce. Local power, water supply, whatever. So if G is the spending per resident, so NG is the total spending, then on local public services in the town, then the probability of success is some function pi that depends on G, or it could have been parameterized by NG. I think I'll do it in terms of per capita. N will be a constant in the town. It's not a variable in this story. So this pi is a increasing concave function. It's got a derivative. The usual assumptions, pi of g, of course, is between 0 and 1, and if you don't spend anything, you have no chance. So pi of 0 is 0 says that if nothing is spent, if there's no public services in this town, then you're definitely going to lose your money, so don't invest, and therefore people are going to be impoverished. So the budget for local public services, however, is managed by a local official who can divert any part of it to private personal consumption, or even can steal all of it and flee abroad, which means that 1 year's annual budget of NG could be stolen by this official, and then she can go live on it in a foreign country immune from prosecution. So in order to get the money spent, and we can't do it without giving it to this official, we need an official to control the money because it's public investment. The official will prefer to retain office with an annual salary of R per resident, N times R in aggregate, rather than fleeing abroad with the annual budget of NG if the the present discounted value at a beta discount rate, beta discount factor, excuse me. So that's I divide it by 1 minus beta because that's the discount factor. Beta is the discount factor. Think of beta as being a number close to 1. Has to be greater than NG. So that says an annual salary, if beta is a discount factor of close to 1, like 0.9 or 0.95, so 1 minus beta times G is how much you have to promise the official every year, forever, for a lifetime that's essentially infinite. And this is what we call moral hazard rents. You have to say, if you want to have this official exercising power over a large budget, the person has to expect that exercising this power appropriately will be fruitful and lucrative, and this person therefore has to be paid this amount. So being a local powerful office is a valuable office in this because of the moral hazard here. But within this model, the abstraction I want you to assume is that the only visible evidence of the official's actual spending as opposed to the part that the official spends on her own private consumption is the number of successes among the residents, which is a binomial random variable, and the number of people, number of trials. I'm assuming this success failure is independent across resident and across years, conditionally on the spending. So the probability of success is pi of g, and n is the number of trials you have, is the number of people in the town, and that statistic is the only evidence of the successes among the of how much the official has actually spent. It's an imperfect statistic, but if n is large, then there's a relatively, proportionally small, there's a very small standard deviation for the fraction of people who have successes. It's going to have a very tight distribution around the expected value of a pi fraction, pi of g fraction. So it's a good statistic, but it's the only statistic. And I'll assume that only each resident is the only person who knows whether his or her private enterprise was successful this year. So you see what we're going to do about this. Each individual's benefit, a resident's expected annual benefit, then, if the local residents pay for the public services, then pi of g times s. I'm looking at the top here. Pi of g times s is the expected returns from the project. 1 minus beta times k, that's the amortization of the cost of the initial investment. G is the spending, and R is what we have to set aside for each of us to pay the salary of our local official, who has to be paid a handsome salary because she has so much power and we don't want her to run away with the money. That's the annual benefit. I'm going to assume, by the way, that well, you can figure, there's a little formula here that says how you optimize it. You take a derivative and set it equal to 0, and there's some G1 that's the optimum that maximizes this difference. And I'm going to assume, of course, that this is positive and even large. Otherwise, there's a trivial solution. We don't bother with any of these public services. These are valuable public services, but they have to be reliably provided, or else the investments wouldn't have been made in the first place. Can we do it? And the answer is yes, of course. I don't know whether it's, so what is, I'm not going to read that proposition. Let's just read the simple plan. The simple plan is going to be the official is going to get some budget B, is going to pick a per capita spending G that's actually could be B or 0 or anywhere in between. And then if a fraction, then we're going to ask the residents, how do you feel about the local official at the end of the year? Did you have a success or not? And that which is essentially a vote. We're going to the finding out. So we'll ask how many people had a success, and if the fraction of residents who report success is bigger than some theta, then we'll pay the official a bonus of rho and retain her for next year, and she gets to do it again. And the proposition says let epsilon be any small positive number. We can get the budget to be equal to the optimal budget G1, and we can pay her just a tiny bit more per person than the theoretical minimum, and this will work when the number of and this will provide good incentives to spend virtually everything correctly, at least if n is a large number. Lim n goes to infinity is saying if n is a large number, and the way you do it is you set a threshold that's just a little bit, this is divided by the square root of n. Log n is a big number, but it's much smaller than the square root of n. So this is saying a large number of the standard deviation of the fraction of successes goes to 0 as 1 over the square root of the population size n. And so you take many standard deviations, but that's a small fraction, and when n is large, that's the threshold. It's just a little bit less than if what she, so when she spends pi of g or close to it, when she spends g1, the right amount, which is what we're going to give her, she's going to be many standard deviations above the threshold, and her probability of success is going to be almost 1, and we'll be paying her enough so that, this is saying we're going to pay her enough so that she strictly prefers that than to steal the money, and maybe she'll spend a little bit less, but not much, because if she spent a lot less, then she would go below the threshold. So it works. It's because we have a good statistic. I think I'll skip this in the interest of time. I want to remark here that this is an equilibrium of the game. I should say that there's the paper I talk about how the game could be perturbed slightly so that voters strictly prefer to say that yes, I've had a success if I had a success, and no, I didn't have a success if I didn't. There's a remark here that even if the threshold is not a half, you could still do it with majority voting if people who are on the expected long side randomly abstain. And Feddersen and Pessendorfer's wonderful study of the swing voters' curse is a theory of that kind of stuff. I should note that there's such a thing as distrustful equilibrium. This is just one equilibrium of the local political game. That there's also if for some reason we didn't trust our local official, then we'd prefer to replace the incumbent official if we expected her to steal the budgeted funds in the future, and the official would prefer to steal the budgeted funds if she expected voters to replace her, and because let's run away with the money now if I'm not going to be paid anything in the future. And so you can sort of have a certain random political risk, which then increase that to the extent that this happens with some higher probability, this loss of trust between the residents and their local official, that increases the cost of local public goods. So I'm making the point that if political risk gets in the way, if things that other than performance can terminate the good relationship between the local official and the voters, the citizens of this area, that extraneous political risk makes it harder for local politics to work. And so I'm not saying that local politics always creates this wonderful outcome, but at least it's possible that there's a good equilibrium of a voting game, of a local political game, and there's an easy solution, which in principle can, if the voters have the right kind of expectation, which is as long as my officials provide me good government, I should probably re-elect them. I should say, I think in practice, we don't always re-elect, of course, but what we do actually is we typically have very stable party systems in which when a party loses, they know that if they've provided reasonably good government, they might lose the next election, but in a couple of years, they're likely to come back. The kind of rebellion you've just seen in this country, where in many places people have turned outside the standard party system, is quite rare, and if it were more common, I think there would be democracy would function very much less well. Whether the voters were right to want to turn against their established party because of unique situations recently is of course something I'm not a foreigner ready to judge, but the normal, if parties have some political risk, the fact that they normally expect to come back, but that they could lose that if they really blow it with extreme corruption, is how the system should work. Okay. Now so there was a model in which local politics solved the model. There were multiple equilibria, some not so good, but there's a good equilibrium of local politics that gets the efficient public investment. The efficient public investment still involves the local official getting rich, by the way. There's something that could be called corruption, because I didn't say this local official was working very hard or in any way better than the rest of us, but because our local official has control over our public funds, that we have to concentrate in order to get the investment done right, the assumption is somebody has to control the investment, and that somebody could take those resources and run away with it. Some kind of moral hazard rents is the nice economic term for it. It has to be paid, but those moral hazard rents, we've minimized the cost of moral hazard rents. The incentive constraint is binding, and you can't do it for less. And that incentive efficient solution, to use the technical term, is is achieved by local politics. So let's talk about centralized government. So the title of the paper was Local Agency Cost of Political Centralization. So now in order to make the point, and I'm not sure, we'll see how well I do or don't make the point, I want to say when we go to a centralized regime, the centralized regime can't do as well as the decentralized politics can. So I'm going to talk first about a model of autocratic centralized government, and then I'll go to democratic centralized government. Democratic centralized government means that there's one national leader who's elected either directly like a president or indirectly like a prime minister, but that one national leader then controls all local government, but is elected. That'll be the the last model, but the middle model is that I want to develop is there's a centralized autocratic government. So what does autocracy mean is a good question. I'll get to that in a slide or two. I'll give you a formalization of what I mean by autocratic government. It seems obvious, but let me say it. So suppose an autocratic national ruler has power over the local government. On this slide, first I want to say if the national ruler, whether autocratic or let's a king. Let me just talk about an autocratic king. If the national ruler, think of him as a king, could commit to let a town elect an autonomous local government in exchange for a tax to the treasury. So I'm the king of this country. Suddenly it occurs to me, why don't I let you guys in Barcelona elect your own mayor, but you'll have to pay a tax for that privilege, but then I'll wash my hands. You're going to really control who your mayor is. You get to do exactly like in the previous. Well, actually, you guys should be willing to pay a tax for that privilege. If I could credibly guarantee that I'm going to stop having any control over your municipal government. Right now, as king, I control all government, but I'm going to let you control your local government. Then, your government, U of G1 was the number that, how much payoff you would get. If anything up to that could be a tax paid to the center. So you can see kings have an incentive to grant local government privileges. But actually, it's even better than that. Because supposing I get, remember, the first, within my solution, the efficient solution, the local official actually does a good job and keeps getting reelected. There's always a threat of losing the reelection. But the local official is getting these huge moral hazard rents. The moral hazard rents are equal to 1 year's budget, because I assumed that the local official could run away with and consume 1 year's budget and live off 1 year's budget. So if you don't give her a lifetime salary that has a present discounted of 1 year's budget, she's going to run away with it. But how about I, as king, not only do I give you grant you the right to have your local government, but I'm going to nominate your first mayor, who in fact you're going to keep reelecting in the good equilibrium. That means that first mayor is going to get moral hazard rents that are worth N R of G on an annualized basis, and these moral hazard rents make the local offices valuable prizes for which candidates would readily pay, whether in cash or in political support. I'm going to focus on the political support need. A king doesn't, a theoretical hereditary monarch you might think might not need political support, but might just want the money. But I'll think of more realistically of political support. So promising offices as patronage prizes can help raise vital support or just cash contributions against challengers. So what am I saying? This is obvious, but I think I hope it's helpful to put it into a model. I want my model of politics to include the fact that being mayor of a prosperous town is a pretty good position, and people would presumably pay money to be there or in service. And so the king, in this within our idealized model, if the ruler appointed the first official, the office could be sold to a supporter for cash or political services that are worth NG, the present discounted value of the moral hazard rents of power, and the residents could be taxed U of G. So I'm in my little world, the fiscal plus political benefits to the ruler are going to have an annual per resident value of U plus R of G, and now you want the optimal G maximizes that. And by the way, the optimal G is more public spending. It's because we've now internalized the cost of the local public of the moral hazard rents. So my basic point is that within the model we can see that the ruler, there is good reason for a ruler to create autonomous local government. and also, but also that the ruler wants to centralize the moral hazard rents. The ruler would like the power to appoint at least the first mayor. The problem is the mayor must be accountable, and it doesn't work if the mayor isn't accountable to the people of Barcelona in this story. The king's appointment, the king might appoint the first mayor, but the first mayor will just steal the money, and then nobody should invest in business in Barcelona if there isn't local accountability in the future. But the power to appoint a valuable job is, of course, an important one, and of course, national leaders like that. Okay. But I want to argue in the second slide, this slide, that the rulers actually don't, so I'm going to argue that this is the title is Local Agency Costs of Political Centralization. Obviously, if the king allows the municipality to decentralize power, it's no longer a centralized autocracy. The king is still an autocrat, but there's some decentralization of power. So I'm going to talk about the problems of if the king doesn't make a credible commitment to let local politics control the local institutions. These plans, the story I just told you would require the ruler to make a credible commitment to a constitutional division of power, which maybe the ruler can make such a commitment, but it would certainly be against the ruler's interests ex post, with local accountability. It says the ruler cannot use the local offices as rewards in the future, and cannot even use it now without making his reputation. I'm going to say that any political leader needs a reputation for reliably rewarding good service. And if I can appoint you to mayor of a large city, if you're a key supporter of mine, if one of my options is to promise you that I'll appoint you a mayor or a governor of a prosperous region of our country where you'll be able to enrich yourself in public office, then it's important to me that people who support me know that when I promise them that I'll give them an appointment if they work hard for me, that they will get the good rewards. However, if my appointing you mayor of some town, that your appointment then the value of it actually depends on the people re-electing you there. Now my reputation for rewarding supporters is dependent on the local voters' approval, and I become vulnerable to their distrust. And in particular, if some enemy stirs up distrust of my official and switches the equilibrium from the good equilibrium where they trust my appointed official to a bad equilibrium where they don't, suddenly the whole thing breaks down, and my ability to pass out these rewards is so local politics, when it's evaluating the people I appointed to whom I owe a debt, becomes a problem for me. With a second problem, and this may be even worse, with political autonomy, the successful local leaders can build reputations for public service and patronage that themselves make them serious competitors, could make them serious competitors for national leadership. That was essentially the point of my other paper that I told you about in the first slide. And that local government, autonomous local government, becomes a grounds in which people can prove their ability to be good leaders for the population that might make the population want them to be in higher office. And if I'm the king, I don't want you to get all excited about somebody else being king, being a possibly better king. So the fiscally beneficial decentralization of power may be politically too costly for the incumbent national political leader. And so I'm going to now look at a centralized autocracy where the leader the king or the monarch of the country retains the ultimate decision about appointing and dismissing all local officials. So proposition, any political leader needs a reputation for reliably rewarding good, loyal service. A leader can get more support now, I want to tell you about briefly about my American Political Science Review paper of 2008. Any leader, I want to argue, can get more support, can enroll more people in making more sacrifices for the leader's political cause when key supporters monitor how the leader treats other people, so that a failure to deliver promised rewards to a supporter, the failure to reward one supporter as expected, as promised, would cause all supporters to distrust. I guess in this APSR model, it's a model of an autocracy where the autocrat still has to occasionally fight challengers for power, even in traditional monarchies. So there was always the possibility of another member of the royal family becoming a challenger for power, and you need people willing to fight for you on those occasions. And so what I showed in my paper in 2008 was that in a simple model, if any leaders can organize such a court, the prince's court is an institution in which promotions and demotions of high officials are discussed publicly, and the prince has to justify his promotion or demotion of major leaders and local lieutenants and supporters, and the people in that, I'll call them courtiers, what is a courtier? A courtier is a high official, a person who's powerful in the government and also spends a lot of time following the monarch around and attends meetings of the prince's court. If anybody contenders for power can organize a court where his key supporters monitor how he treats all the other supporters, so that not rewarding one would cause them all to distrust him and would cause his downfall. If any leaders can organize such a court that polices his promises to supporters, then no challengers can recruit any supporters without instituting such constraints. So that was the main theorem. So I'm going to say, to me, an autocratic ruler is one who by definition is politically accountable only to such courtiers. It is a fallacy to believe that there are monarchs who simply rule by themselves. Everyone who has ruled a large population has done it with the help of hundreds of dozens of close lieutenants and hundreds of key supporters. And those people, not the possibly millions who are ruled, but at least those hundreds and those dozens and hundreds and a few thousand elite soldiers need to trust that their support of the monarch will be rewarded, or the monarch is just one person waking up in the morning and with a lot of jealous people around. So everyone who's ruled a country is politically accountable to someone, but to me, in my abstraction, the autocratic ruler is only politically accountable to the courtiers. And their job, you understand, is to deter wrongful dismissals. If he's going to promise moral hazard rents he's going to pay people by appointing them to offices that have large moral hazard rents. Well, one of the advantages of being an autocrat is whenever there's a vacancy, you get to reward somebody by appointing them to one of these valuable offices. But the fact that you can profitably resell a vacant office means you now have an incentive to try to find people guilty of malfeasance. And how is that deterred? It's deterred by the courtiers, by the fear that if I dismiss too many people, that my loyal supporters will begin to become distrustful of me. So in a centralized... Now, information. The dismissals have to be made when local public services are not well provided. In a centralized autocracy, I'm going to assume, I think it's realistic to assume, that local residents cannot simply communicate their complaints about bad public services. Local residents cannot communicate their political discontent in an autocratic regime. In a centralized autocracy, the channels of communication between local residents and the people who could possibly challenge the official, which is the ruler, which are the court around him, that channel of communication is controlled. The local residents cannot communicate their complaints about bad performance of local officials without some kind of tolerance or permission of the regime. And I'm assuming that tolerance that permission has to be granted at the highest level. So I certainly want to allow that the autocrat can get the information. So the autocrat, in my little abstraction, certainly can send out private spies to send back personal reports to the royal palace about discontent in this or that village. And so the autocrat can get the information and find out whether his appointed officials are serving the local people well or badly. But the autocrat cannot make a credit. But can the autocrat commit to use the information? He can't commit to using it, and he can't he can tell the other courtiers, I got some bad reports. Maybe he can even show them the bad reports, but maybe he can show those bad reports selectively when he wants to get rid of someone. Oh, I've been getting bad reports, so that's why I'm firing this person. The autocrat cannot commit to using this information with, or sharing this information with the courtiers, or use it or share it unselectively. The only people who can impose political costs on the ruler are the courtiers, but these costs can't depend on information that the ruler can manipulate, because information that the ruler controls will be manipulated to minimize the political costs that are imposed by the court. So here's the model. So every year, at the end of the year, the king can dismiss some set D of officials, and the courtiers observe it. That is what princely courts do. When major public officials, appointed officials, are being thrown to the wolves, then turned out of the inner circle, they know about it, and they observe it. And if it's a big set, so phi of D is the penalty, a political penalty. Essentially, the king, if he dismisses a lot of officials, he has to do a lot of penance for it, perhaps. Ivan the Terrible famously killed a lot of his courtiers, but then he also did enormous penance all the anyway. For years. Now, within the little model, let nu of J be the service value, the net service value that the ruler could get from replacing official J, sacking official J, and then appointing someone else to that office. Now, I'm assuming nu of J can't be bigger than NG when NG is the budget that's spent. That's the moral hazard rents. But it could be less because you're not actually selling for cash. You're selling for the office for service, and maybe a service that is worth NG to the new appointee has a value to the king that's less than that. But now the set of dismissals this year should be chosen to maximize the net value of replacing the office, the sum over all dismissed offices J of the value of putting somebody new. The nu of J is the value of putting somebody new in the office J, minus the political cost that you have to pay to calm down the rest of your inner circle when D is the set of phi of D is the political cost of calming down your inner circle, restoring their faith after you've just dismissed a set D. So I've got a little example here that works. It says here's something that could work. Supposing that NG is whatever nu of J is, it's less than NG. So this says there's no cost of dismissing one person, but then for everybody else you dismiss, you have to pay a cost of NG, of political cost. Now, then the ruler's going to be willing to dismiss just one official, and I guess it can work because the ruler can say, my policy is I'm going to dismiss the local official who provides the worst public services. So the truth is I don't have the result. If nu and phi treat the officials symmetrically, then the ruler could be willing to pick the dismissal set based on the private information, the private reports about whether the people the local people are happy or unhappy with their. Okay, but then again, wait a minute. The ruler would be equally willing to dismiss the one guy not with the worst public services, but one of the best public services. And I'll give you a reason why the ruler might do that. Because the local official who you just appointed mayor of a town somewhere, who's providing the best public services, is somebody who maybe, because he's being so good to the people, might eventually become a national challenger. And that would be a good reason to get rid of that person before he gets even more popular. So I want to say these nu of J replacement values may depend on a lot of political details that only the ruler observes. Suggestions that J might become politically disloyal in some important way. Suggestions that J might offer some extra political support that would be valued, or a new supporter's special desire or suitability for the office that J is holding. So I want to say from the courtier's perspectives, these nu of J numbers are random variables. The courtiers don't know them. So now here's where I get the result. I'm going to assume that these nu of J are random variables, and the technical assumption is that even conditional on what the others are, each one has a conditional positive density over some interval. So if you like, they're independent random variables over some interval, each with a positive density over some interval, or at least conditional on the others. Each one conditional on the others has a positive density over some interval. There's some uncertainty. Once I have that, remember the ruler is going to choose his dismissal set to maximize the total net benefit minus the costs, and the courtiers can impose the cost, but they don't know exactly what the benefits are. And now, whatever function they choose, given their information, given that there's this much uncertainty about the new random variables, the probability of the ruler being dismissed, being totally indifferent between 2 or more dismissal sets is going to be 0, which means that with probability 1, the ruler has no indifference. National political considerations have uniquely determined who he dismisses and who he doesn't. And therefore, it doesn't depend on local public services that the courtiers don't see. It could, if a local official is building a road that everybody from the capital that everybody travels on, then of course if the road isn't built, everybody can see it. But I'm talking about in a remote village, people are unhappy because they're getting bad protection, bad local protection or whatever, a lot of corruption in the local police that are run by our local official. Then the courtiers don't know about it, and they have no way of really finding out about it. So the proposition is, in a nation where people have no protected independent channels for expressing political grievances, allowing separate courtiers to have their own separate information networks that the ruler tolerates would be a kind of decentralization that might allow this. But in a nation where people have no protected independent channels for expressing political grievances, an autocrat who has unrestricted power to appoint and dismiss local officials cannot be credibly committed to hold them accountable for public services that are observed only by the local residents. That's a long sentence, but it summarizes the whole deal. I should say, beyond this model, neutrality could also be subverted by influential courtiers. If the ruler were completely indifferent, if they could be neutral, the courtiers themselves, in fact, are likely to have patron-client relationships with some of these lower officials, and they can raise slightly the ruler's cost of dismissing an official as better connections with him as patrons, and that would also subvert the neutrality. So the result is going to be, I've tried to give you a model, not a great mathematical model, but a model in which we see how local political concerns drive out the obscure information about the fact that the local residents are getting terrible public services because the official is stealing most of the budget. But ex ante, the local residents are not going to invest when good public services are not assured, and therefore the country is impoverished. So that's the story of poverty. I've got, I think, 4 minutes. Let me say something about decentralized democracy. And on this slide, I better skip it and simply say, the question I want to ask is, let me say, in democracy, freedom of speech is certainly having advantages. That in a centralized democracy, freedom of speech means that local residents can at least get the information to the elite, who, under any system, a political leader needs a reputation for distributing patronage to his supporters. Freedom of speech does have an advantage for democracy. There are actually political risk in democracy makes problems. Some things are the same, some things are different. But the question I want to ask is, if local accountability yields better public services, could democracy induce the leaders to promise it? So let me jump up. I'll skip that and jump straight to the model in the paper. So here's the story. I'm going to assume that, I should say, in this story, I'm sorry, I do have to say it. The bottom of the slide, I quickly talk about a model in which the Democratic competitors can promise how much money, how much money did the incumbent just spend on public services in your community? So you know it. The challenger, let's assume, can come in and make a credible commitment to spend possibly more in your community, but they want to spend as little as possible. Well, the solution, a competitive solution, can be take some place where the incumbent has spent the most money, set it to 0. I'm not going to spend anything there, but I'll spend a little bit more in provinces that have a majority of the population. And now those people, if my promises are believed, let's assume people can make credible promises in a campaign, then I get elected the next president. Of course, once I'm president, then the next campaign, somebody's going to take where I was offering the most and set it to 0 and offer a little more than in the places where I sent the least, in new majority. And these offers over time are going to converge to small offers everywhere. So that didn't work. Sorry, centralized democracy didn't work. But let's change it and say there's a fixed budget. It's none of this incremental stuff. There's a fixed budget, and there's only 2 questions. But I, as president, can appoint your mayor or governor. However, I could say, let's suppose I can make, when I'm campaigning, a credible promise to let you guys I'll poll you regularly, and if you don't like the performance of my person, I'll replace that person always. So I'm going to give you the local accountability that worked in the first model. Or I could go to some campaign supporter and say, pay me a lot of money, and I'll appoint you governor of this province, and you can steal the whole budget. Let's assume I cannot make both of those promises credibly, because of course I'd like to both raise money by selling the office and convince you that I won't sell the office to someone who's going to loot the budget. So let's assume I have to choose one or the other, but when I do, people will, either side I'll be believed. So now this is a standard model. The basic point is, to win elections, you need some people to think you're promising good policies, but you also need money. You need to spend some money. So here, and you're going to raise the money by promising favors. So, the story. This is a variation of standard models. There's some fraction alpha who are uninformed voters. 1 minus alpha are the informed voters, and they're going to vote for whoever promises the best local government in their districts. Let's say local government is the only question in that national politics in this model. But alpha are uninformed, impressionable voters, and they're going to vote for candidates in proportion to how much those candidates have spent, and that spending is financed by selling offices. Well, so there's the game. Let Xi denote the fraction of districts that the candidate sells to a donor, and well, here I repeated it over here. Let Xi denote the fraction of districts that a candidate sells to a donor. The difference of votes between the candidate. There are two candidates, 1 and 2. They made some promises. So let's see. The campaign spending by candidate 1 is X1, and he's going to get vote. The alpha uninformed voters are going to vote for him rather than the other one in proportion to the difference between their spending, which is alpha X1 minus X2 over the sum. And on the other hand, the 1 minus alpha guys are going to vote for whoever promises the better amount. And I assume that if in a province where we both promised good accountable government, that they split equally between candidates 1 and 2, so it nets out to 0. Anyway, so there's the formula. You take the derivative to get first order conditions for an optimum, and here's the result. In an equilibrium of a 2-candidate election, each candidate would maintain inefficient centralized management of local public services in a fraction that's this. Let's say if alpha, let's say only a third of the voters are uninformed, impressionable voters in this little model. 2/3 vote for whoever promises better local government. So alpha is 1/3. 1/3 over 2/3 is a half. Well, let's say 1/3. So that's 1/3 divided by 1/3 divided by 2/3 is. I'm having trouble with my math, but I think that's a quarter of all the districts. If I get that right, anyway. Yeah. So 25% of the districts, I think. I remember with 1/3 of the voters, 25% of the districts are promised bad government. The possibility of such neglected regions should be considered extremely dangerous for a nation's territorial integrity if there's any outside option for disaffected regions to secede. And I note that in Ukraine, presidential politics actually looks a lot like this. So let me conclude. I'm done. So we've analyzed a model of moral hazard in public and local public investments, which could be efficiently managed with local political accountability. When local public services are observed only by local residents, officials can be held accountable only if their careers depend on local residents' approval. And political decentralization, I've argued, means by definition guaranteeing that local officials will find their careers are dependent on local residents' approval. But a national ruler who can resell vacant offices is not a neutral judge of local public services. And in a centralized autocracy, local residents have a problem communicating their complaints to the national elite, who have to approve any decisions to dismiss the responsible officials, drawing on my 2008 paper. So an autocratic national government is going to have great difficulty making a credible commitment to sustain efficient local investments unless there is some guarantee of local political rights. And without local political centralization, we're going to find, the model was meant to show how without political decentralization, local officials' positions within the model depended more on national political relationships rather than their local public services, and therefore they have no incentive to spend any money on local public services. I argued maybe outside the model, appealing to my previous paper, the national leaders under any system have a strong political reasons to prefer political centralization, even when it harms economic development. But in the unitary democratic state, in the model of the unitary democratic state, where the candidates who win national power want voters' approval, and the voters really would prefer a candidate who promised democratic accountability, decentralized accountability of their local officials. Nonetheless, competitively elected national leaders may choose to keep inefficient centralized control of many local offices so that they can use them as patronage rewards for contributors. However, federal democracy, although national leaders don't want to decentralize, federal democracy can become stable once it's established, because elected mayors and governors become vital local power brokers who have an important role in national coalition building. Certainly, I want to say in the history of my country, the United States, the founding fathers of the United States government in around 1789 had to accept substantial decentralization of power in the new nation because autonomous local governments in the British Empire, in the British imperial system, autonomous local governments had been established over a century before. So since the foundations of the United States, I believe, we should recognize that democratic local governments in the United States oversaw local public investments in one part of the country after another that provide the basic framework for building such a what became the richest nation on earth. And I believe that when people think about decentralization and they want to learn lessons from the successful rich countries, that this is an important lesson, that the devolution of power, forcing it on the national leadership, can pay off in national wealth because of better local public investments. So let me stop there. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes to entertain some questions, if anyone wants to start. Ramon?
Thanks for an inspiring lecture. Okay, now we have to absorb everything. But let me ask you something, whether I can just turn the issue around. So here we are in Europe, so we are used to have all these levels, okay? Yeah. And sometimes what happens is precisely that the national politicians, they don't want to have more at the central European level. There are many things that citizens will really benefit when working at the European level, but all the national prime ministers are prime ministers for their own country, and the rents are in their own country, and they're very reluctant to do that. Yes. That sounds to me like the other side of the coin of what you were telling us.
You're absolutely right. And I'm not sure how to feel. I feel passionately that, so let's say, certainly their vested interest in retaining power at the level of Spain and France and Germany is going to mean that gives them a reason, and they are very important people, that certainly tilts the question of distribution of power between the national and European level in a way that has nothing to do with what's good for the general population. You're absolutely right. So it should, and then of course the general principle is one of the power tends to stay at whatever level it was historically. And it means that, for example, when, and that's not a policy variable, except in one time it was when colonialism ended and authorities, the former colonial masters liberated the countries that they had controlled. Their decision about at what level to distribute power was in some sense likely to have long-term effects. That certainly. But I have to tell you, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the costs. The title of this paper was Local Agency Costs of Political Centralization, and this is half of what I thought. The other half was this ladder of democratic advancement, the value of local governments providing new leadership that enriches national government. And here I've talked about the advantages of decentralization for local public goods. And I think both of these are significant effects and important that I've talked about of failure to devolve power downward. And I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about the disadvantages to Europe of not sharing enough power up. It's a new question. It's a good, thank you, Ramon, you're ahead of me on that one. Let me stop there, I guess, except to say it had intrigued me. I think the performance of the Eurozone, I have been, and maybe I even still am, a Eurozone optimist, because I thought a good way to get an independent central bank is to have a weak confederation. The central bank has to be politically accountable, but having a weak confederation and monetary union across the confederation means that you have, the central bank can be accountable to the confederation level. It's not accountable to any one national government, and yet, because they're weak, it's a weak confederation, they're still pretty independent. But so that's an advantage to having the top level is weaker than the national level. But the central, you know what, monetary policy has been, well, it hasn't been stellar, has it, in the Eurozone so far. Anyway, so I stop there. I'll just say, you're right, but I'm not prepared to say what are the underappreciated advantages of putting more power up to the Europe level, but they might be there.
Thank you for this conference. I'm overwhelmed by what you presented, but I think, yeah, we'll have to digest some of it. Let me ask about something you said at the beginning and then at the end, which is this advantage of having these decentralized governments where you may have politicians that come up to the national level, so you may have less corruption at the national levels because you get people out of the government when they, you know, they're caught or whatever.
Right.
But do you think that works also for political systems where there are closed lists, like the ones we have in Spain, where political parties are the ones that really decide who is going to be running for central government or local government or this,
So,
you know?
yes. So as a game theorist, we study the competitive rules matter, and there are many things. I like using the phrase lowering barriers to entry into national politics, into democratic competition, because that's of course a familiar economic phrase that we know that profit-taking in economic markets depend on barriers to entry, and the idea that barriers to entry in political competition would determine the level of corrupt profit-taking is a good starting concept for thinking about democratic institutions. Freedom of speech lowers barriers to entry, first of all, because and freedom to organizing new political movements. The electoral system can matter. Proportional representation has the advantage that it makes new parties easier to start, and that in principle should have some advantage. Within proportional representation system, I do believe the difference between an open list and a closed list. An open list meaning that the party nominates a list of candidates. It should be called really an ordered and unordered list, but the open list means that the voters on election day, when they support a party, also have an opportunity to indicate their preference among the candidates on the party's list, and the members of the list who actually get seated who get the seats that are won by the party are determined by those preferences on election day. That creates internal competition within the party for party activists to broaden their base of support or to earn the confidence of more voters, and obviously a closed list means the most important thing in a party that's going to get dozens of seats, and now you want to be one of the top 10 in the party list, and the way to do that is in a closed list is to have a lot of friends on the party central committee and do favors for the party central committee. So certainly there are advantages to open lists. In all of these questions, we should recognize that competitors do not like to have their system become more competitive. So economists and game theorists, we should be thinking, and political scientists should be studying the relative nature of whether different systems increase or decrease the competitive nature of politics, and try to make the argument public so that people can understand. And I think this, you're right, these are first-order questions that an open list would be much more, is in general, you should think, is much more competitive than a closed list. And therefore, one should expect it's likely to bring better leadership, more accountable leadership.
Another question? I have a small comment, if there is no other question, which is, I've always been surprised that the Minister of Finance of France or the Minister of Public Works in France is the mayor of a big city at the same time. And I thought, upon following up, I don't know the history of that,
Yeah.
but I thought, connection to Ramon's question, that maybe the only way to get people to have less resistance to Europe is to allow them to accumulate the two jobs, you know. But I'm not sure that this would be optimal in any other way. So I'm not pushing for that, just a general comment. It is the case.
Multi-party coalition governments have another advantage, that a small party that's a partner gets a ministry and the opportunity to show what they can do with power. And to some extent, that should be recognized as a potential competitive advantage. We typically understand, political scientists typically see the advantages of more coherent government when there's a small number of parties and one party government may have some advantages in cohesiveness. But the truth is, one can see we should recognize some potential advantages and competitiveness of competition among parties in exercising power, not locally, but across different ministries. If that effect exists, if the small party that does a good job with this ministry then makes people more inclined to vote for it in the future.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Myerson. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming and for participating in the discussion. And now I would like to invite you to the foyer next door for a small cover reception.
Well, thank you for inviting me.